right? Yeah. Well, we'll begin with a recorded anecdote from the life of Kung Fu Si. And Kung Fu Si is the person that we know as Confucius. His culture and the way he practiced life was filled with reverence for ancient ways. And they worshipped ancestors, and the worship that the ancestors had that went so far back, it went back beyond memory, perhaps even into Atlantis. And this is an interesting thing in that some religions and philosophies think the golden age was in the past, and some think that the golden age is in the future. And it has a lot to do with the different kinds of psychologies that people have. Kung Fu Si, who was obviously one of the former, he believed that the ancient rituals came from extremely wise people, and that they were probably more wise than anyone of his time. Now, one time they were performing an ancient ritual, and in the middle of the performance, he interrupts the proceedings. And he begins to question, what are we doing? And why are we doing it? And needless to say, the other people were quite disconcerted by this. That's putting it mildly. And the response to this from Kung was to ask them whether they knew that this interruption and this questioning was actually part of this particular ritual. And they didn't know that. And so they were embarrassed about it. Now that was about 2,500 years ago. And since then, the scientific method has been developed. And it is based on questioning and on doubt. In investigation of everything, it's the basis now of our culture. Science, art, religion are all based on questioning. Good morning. And even modern religion is based on questioning. And ancient people had a different kind of consciousness. They believed because they couldn't not believe. That inner experience or spiritual experience was so real to them that they couldn't doubt it. Modern people believe because they can doubt. And if we're truly sincere in our doubting, we doubt until something proves itself true. Now this applies to the Rosicrucian Fellowship especially. Max Heindel tells us in the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception it's written for questioning minds. In fact, on the very first edition, on the title page, there is a quote from St. Paul that says, "Prove all things." Now, more than that, Max Heindel asks us many times to ponder his writings and to dig deep into them. He said that what he writes is only on the surface. And if you dig deeper, you'll find something that might be even different. But you'll find something that is very rich and profound. Now, I've met many members of the Rosicrucian Fellowship, and I have found that very few have followed this advice. In this little talk, we're going to remedy that a little bit. we're going to try to clarify at least two of his statements a little bit. Now, these talks are meant to be about very elementary astro-diagnosis. Each day we take a different disease or a different condition and try to study its spiritual origin in the patient. We're trying to do this with the aid of astrology. We're trying to diagnose the condition so that we can see it in others and turn the tide so that it doesn't have to manifest as a disease. Now today we're going to talk about cancer. And there is very little mention of cancer in the literature of the Rosicrucian Fellowship. Because at the time of the founding of the Rosicrucian Fellowship, cancer wasn't the major condition that it is now. In the 36 example horoscopes in Message of the Stars, there are no examples of cancer horoscopes. There are two examples in Astro-Diagnosis, A Guide to Healing, but they're both very short, and neither of them is diagnosed very well. I suspect they are both by Mrs. Heindel. In one case, it is self-identified as being from Mrs. Heindel. I'm not very fond of what she did astrologically. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a critique. And if we're going to do that, we might just as well do a good job of it. Though in some corners, I'm not likely to make a lot of friends doing this. In the subject of the disease of cancer, it's one of the very few places in Max Heindel that he directly contradicts himself. In one place, he suggests that cancer is incurable because it is a sin against the Holy Ghost, and that is unforgivable except by expiation. Now that statement in itself is contradictory to Christianity, because Christ said, ask whatsoever ye will. He didn't say ask whatsoever ye will except in the case of cancer. It's a pretty strong statement. In another place, Max Heindel says, cancer is curable in some cases, and that one must not give up hope once one hears its diagnosis. And he proceeds to tell about what you can do to cure it. In one place, when he's speaking about studies of past lives, he gives a tentative etiology for cancer. He says that, he tries to give it a basis of it on the basis of misuse of the sexual organ or the sexual force. But he says there is not enough information so that we can form a law and say this is the way it goes. In another place, he just says point blank that cancer is due to excessive lascivious behavior. Now, from all of this, we see there are seeming contradictions. And we see that it is a very complicated matter. And that when we try to go into the study of cancer, we're on shaky grounds as far as making definitive diagnostic statements. This is one thing that is clear about the writings of Max Heindel. One thing is very clear, and that is cancer is associated with the procreative force. That's saying a lot, but it's also saying very little at the same time. Very little that you can get your hands on. Cancer is now so widespread in our culture that sexual misuse would have to be very prevalent. And according to the definition of Max Heindel in the Rosicrucian philosophy, using the sexual function for anything but creation is misuse. So by that criterion, one would see that cancer would have to be almost pandemic, because very, very few people are chaste in that way. And very, very few people are not getting cancer. With this being the case, the problem for us who would like to do preventative diagnosis is to find astrological signatures of cancer. It's not easy at all. Now, if you look at many different horoscopes of cancer patients, you find very different horoscopes. With that being the case, you have to have a remarkable intuition. And Max Heindel is correct when he says that diagnosis is improbable and such that you can't make a general law. Now, there are other problems for the astro-spiritual diagnosis of cancer. According to the sexual misuse hypothesis, is cancer a venereal disease? Is it a sexual disease? Those are questions you ask yourself. Then if so, how do you differentiate cancer from the other diseases that are due to misuse of the sexual force? And you have to do that in terms of astrology and in terms of destiny. Now, there are other problems or things to understand. For example, how do carcinogens fit into this? There are many studies that are sound scientifically, and they make sound statistical connections between radiation or chemicals or other carcinogens. Now, it may be likely that carcinogens are secondary or tertiary causes and not root causes. That's the way it is with a lot of things. In fact, most things that material science and medicine deal with, they're dealing with effects and not with causes, and they got onto the train way late. There are many studies that make these connections. So it should be one of our goals in doing spiritual diagnosis to try to harmonize our investigation and its application in a way that is harmonious with divine intent and material science. That's part of our collective salvation, is to bring everything into harmony with divine intent. Once again, in this, there's a multitude of considerations, and we are forced to admit that the mind alone is inadequate to solve these diagnostic problems. Once again, we need to develop the soul body so that we can be receptive and responsive to intuition. Because our mind isn't big enough to handle it, but the intuition can take us right to where we need to go. We don't have to give up because things like this are almost impossibly difficult. We should probably take heart, and we should probably consider these kinds of things challenges. Same way we take difficult puzzles as challenges to work our way through them. The only difference is we realize that puzzles have an answer, and most people don't realize that all of the mysteries have answers too, but you have to work harder than solving a puzzle. Nobody ever said that spiritual attainment would be easy. But we do have a promise. And that promise is, if we are pure at heart and we have loving intent that all of the help and encouragement that is necessary will be given to us. So all we have to do is maintain those few things. While we're on the topic of critiquing some of the statements of Max Heindel, we're going to take on another part of the Rosicrucian philosophy that needs improvement. What is said in the passage that we're going to read is unarguable and is written beautifully, but it is not enough. It's from the Cosmoconception. It is in chapter 1 on the visible and invisible worlds. And it is the section on the ethers, specifically the life ether. This is a very short statement that it makes as an introductory statement to the life ether. Life ether, as the chemical ether, is the avenue for operation of the forces, the object of which is the maintenance of individual form. So the life ether is the avenue for the operation of the forces which have their object the maintenance of the species, the forces of propagation. Like the chemical ether, the life ether also has its positive and negative pole. The forces which work along the positive pole are those which work in the female during gestation. They enable her to do the positive active work of bringing forth a new being. On the other hand, the forces which work along the negative pole of the life ether enable the male to produce semen. In the work on the impregnated ovum of the animal and man, or upon the seed of the plants, the forces working along the positive pole of the life ether produce male plants, animals, and men, while the forces working, which express themselves through the negative pole, generate females. That's the basic statement of the life ether. And in my estimation, it is very inadequate. You can't argue with what is said there. It's taken from direct observation. It's beautiful in its tone, but it is not enough to get the most representative notion of life ether. For that matter, if we look at most of the rest of the writings of Max Heindel about the life ether and its place in the vital body, that inadequacy has not been corrected. The chief function of the life ether is stated in its name: life. Life ether is the difference between living and non-living things. Life ether provides the core functions of the vital body. That's what it performs. Now, one of the functions of the vital body is as a means of transport between the inner bodies and the spirit and the outer dense physical body. Now, to facilitate this, each of the four ethers has a special resonance with one of the concrete bodies. The Rosicrucian Cosmoconception and many of the other writings indicate that there is a special resonance between the concrete mind and the reflecting ether. The desire world is the world of color, and there is a direct relationship between the color in the desire world and coloration in the physical world that comes through the light ether. All chemical interactions in the chemical region of the physical world come about and are facilitated by the chemical ether. But the life of the vital body itself is expressed in the life ether. And you might then say that the life ether is the epitome of the vital body. It is most what the vital body is meant to be. Now, this section that we just read does an excellent job of describing gender differentiation and polarity in reproduction. And in discussing gender differentiation and reproduction through polarity in the ethers, it brings us to the second major function of the life ether. The first major function is vitalization. The second function of the life ether is growth. Growth is not necessarily just a chemical activity. Non-chemicals do not grow. They may expand or contract, but they don't grow. Neither do they heal damaged forms by growth. Growth is accomplished by cell division. The very same kind of polar cell division that is talked about in the differentiation of sex. So cell division and growth is the means of propagation that goes beyond just sexual differentiation, as said in the Rosicrucian cosmoconception. It's accomplished with polarization, and everything in the ethers is accomplished by polarization. Now there is a harmony between polarization in the life ether and the polarization of chemical ether, because chemicals do things, with positives and negatives. That's the whole basis of chemistry. But even though there's polarization and parallelism and active cooperation, they're significantly different. Growth in any organism that has a vital body is not random. It is not amorphous. The vital body, in its complex with the dense physical body, forms into a predetermined matrix, predetermined by the creative being or beings that work on the formation of that organism. And it begins in thought. And the formation occurs within an etheric matrix. And that etheric matrix governs the shape and the state of the vital chemical complex. It is not the DNA. The DNA is an effect. It is not a cause. The control is in the more macrocosmic vital body, and the DNA is just a facilitator. For that matter, the memory is not in the DNA either. The memory is in the etheric vital body. Chemicals don't have what you would call memory. They have, physicists call things like elastic memory or things like that, but that's not really a memory. So it is the growth function in the vital body to which we want to direct our attention. When the spiritual ego, the self, loses control of the growth function in the vital body, that growth function becomes autonomous. And the result is unrestrained growth. And unrestrained growth is a perfect description of cancer. So we're talking about cancer, and we can see that the origin of cancer is not so much in the physical body, even though that may be facilitated by things like carcinogens. The origin is in the etheric body, and it is due to the fact that the self loses control of the growth function. So we can say that indeed cancer is a sexual activity, because it is in that polar cell division that facilitates growth that things have run amok. But even though its origin is in sex, not in the way that we think of sex in terms of organs and things like that, but just in general propagation, cancer is not a venereal disease. So we're starting to resolve these apparent contradictions in Max Heindel. Now, in the Rosicrucian philosophy, we're taught several things about the spiritual ego or the self at this time in the evolutionary creation in which we are participating. One thing is that the self was created in the previous period to our current Earth period. It's called the Moon period. And that self was created then, but it is now in the Earth period that it is awakening. As spiritual aspirants, we're keenly aware of this, and we're constantly seeking more of the light of spiritual consciousness. We want to wake up more. We are, in fact, something like sleeping divinities. Sometimes we experience little awakenings, and it's a great joy. And other times we're humiliated by how stupid and unconscious we are. Another thing that we are taught in the Western Christian mysticism is that there is such a thing as spiritual growth. Some of the more ancient schools teach only spiritual awakening, and that it's all there already and all you have to do is awaken. But in the West, we learn that there is spiritual growth, and it is accomplished by various kinds of experience, with the essence of that experience being absorbed and assimilated into the spirit. The concept of spiritual growth, which is not like material growth, is a very modern concept. It is a growth in quality and in character. It's not like a growth that something gets bigger. It's a matter of the spirit becoming more of itself in itself and having greater spiritual strength. Now, another thing that we are taught is that the spiritual self, or the spiritual ego, is not completely in its body yet, or in its bodies. It is drawing into its bodies, and the process is far from complete. At most, with the concrete mind, it has not been drawn completely into the desire body, the vital body, and the physical body. The bringing in of the higher spiritual vehicles and awakening them is a very slow process. And it's tied up with the whole evolutionary creation and our work in it. And that is tripartite. One part of it is the materialization of spirit. Spirit materializes through bodies. The other part is the spiritualization of matter. That is to say, matter, inherent in matter is becoming spirit. And that in the process of spirit interacting with matter, which is not always, if you're doing dynamiting and mining or something like that, it's not just a gentle process. And so we're waking up the potential of spirit in matter. So we have the spiritualization, the materialization of spirit, the spiritualization of matter, and in the interaction, the third part of the process is the evolution of consciousness. The spirit becomes conscious of itself. At the same time, it spiritualizes matter, and something new is gained for both spirit and matter in the interaction. So that process is something that's very slow, and we're very much at the beginning of it. Now, these three processes are actually taking place concurrently. And in effect, they seem as if they're one activity. Now, being nascent, the spiritual self-consciousness and spiritual power that we have, since we are not drawn in greatly and we are not greatly awake, is that our spiritual abilities are very weak, painfully weak. All of us long for the day that we can do all of the things we want to do, all of the things that the Spirit agonizes over. Instead, we do as was said by St. Paul. When St. Paul said, "The good that I would, I do not, but that which I would not, that do I." And that's, that's so often the way it works. The self, the spirit, has vehicles of consciousness. And those vehicles of consciousness include a concrete mind, a desire body, and a vital body, and finally, the dense physical body. Now, the evolution of these vehicles is older than the spirit that they serve. Because in terms of the evolution, we experience something first, and then that produces a formation in the spirit. For example, when we were mineral-like and we produced form, the holding together of a form, the way the iron holds together now, or such like that tenacity that holds things together was the basis for the development of will. So you can see that from having the material experiences first, the spiritual capacities are developed. So the vehicles of consciousness of the spirit are antecedent to the development of the spirit itself. All right. Now, each of the vehicles of consciousness for the spirit has a nature of its own. And its nature is dependent on the macrocosmic nature of the world out of which it was formed. That is to say that the mind has a mind of its own. And the mind is to produce thought forms. The desire body is to motivate. If there were no restrictions on the vital body, it would be the desire body, it would be in perpetual emotional drama, and it would be motivating this and motivating that. The dense physical body is inertial. It will stay in the form that it's in if there were nothing else vitalizing it or instigating it to activity or anything like that. It would just be there as a lump. And the vital body, the etheric body, would vegetate without anything else operating in it, the vital body would be vegetative. It is the spirit that helps to create, and eventually will totally create, each of its vehicles, that masters and controls these vehicles. But because the spirit is not completely unfolded yet and it's not completely awake, sometimes its vehicles get out of control. If we don't control our desires, they'll destroy us, because they just want it, the desire body just wants to revel in desire. I have a desire body that I would eat myself to death if I left it up to the desire body. It's that kind of the thing that happens. And the case in the desire body is an especially difficult case. It goes back to what is called the fall of humanity. When we took the procreative force into our own hands and utilized it without being led to use it in a specific way by the divine hierarchies, we were proclaiming we were gods. We were proclaiming that we could use the creative force however we would. But we weren't wise enough to do that in harmony with the cosmos, and we weren't ready for that. But the divinities, the hierarchies that guided us, had to respect our divinity. And they could no longer lead us around by the nose. They couldn't take us willy-nilly into all of the experiences we needed. But they couldn't just abandon us either. So what they did is they reflected a pseudo-self, an animal nature, into the desire body, and that was there to protect. Now, over the eons that have developed since then, the spirit has begun to draw in. It's starting to take over. And part of the awakening of the spirit is the resistance that comes from this lower nature. So as a result, we have this constant struggle, this constant warfare that's taking inside of ourselves, which is for the good. But if we let it take over, if we let the desire nature, that lower nature take over, it'll undermine our whole being. All right. Now we have a little bit of a background of cancer. We're saying that it is due to the ego, the spiritual ego, losing control of the growth function in the life ether of the vital body. Now we want to begin to look a little bit at the astrology of it. We have only one horoscope today. This is the horoscope of a cancer survivor who has persisted some 30 years since the original diagnosis of cancer. Now, Max Heindel tells us that the moon is an important planet in cancer diagnosis. He says that this is because Jehovah and the angels operate out of their home base as being the moon. And we said that cancer is due to a sin against the Holy Ghost, and so that we would expect that the moon is very much important in cancer. And the sin against the Holy Ghost is misuse of the creative force. Now, Max Heindel said there's insufficient information to formulate a standard or an archetypal diagnosis of cancer. And I agree with that. If you look at hundreds and hundreds of cases of cancer, you find many different kinds of horoscopes that produce cancer. What I have found mostly, though, is 3 planets are involved in cancer more than any of the other planets. They are the Moon, Neptune, and Saturn. And the Moon and Neptune are 2 of the most imaginative planets. And Saturn is the planet that concretizes things, that brings them down to Earth. So you can see that this is almost like making a statue or something like that, taking an imagination and concretizing it. In this, I would be quick to say that almost any planet can take part in a cancer diagnosis given the right conditions. So I agree with Max Seindel that you can't have something completely standardized. And on this horoscope, you look on the right side of the horoscope, the moon is in Pisces, or Pisces, or however you want to pronounce it. And it's on the descendant. It's just about to sink below the horizon. And it is in opposition to Neptune. And this says that there is an uncontrolled imagination. And that uncontrolled imagination is probably pretty strong. Now, the position of Neptune in the 12th house is significant. It is right on the ascendant, so it reflects directly into the physical body. The ascendant, you might say, is the present moment. And everything going in the direction of the 12th house is the past. And everything going forward is the future. So that the first house is the extreme early childhood. So you can say that before this birth, there was something that had to do with the cancer. And it's very, very clear. This individual who had this cancer was born with it. The way it works is in the embryo there are 3 layers. And some organs come out of one layer, some organs come out of another layer. And in the inmost layer, both the lungs and the intestines form. So sometimes in the developing fetus, when the lungs separate, or actually it's the other way around, when the intestines separate from the lungs, sometimes intestinal cells stay behind in the lungs. And they become the germinal or the seed cells. It's usually, trying to say too many things and not saying anything, one of those things. It's usually a tissue that, it'll come back to me. That is where the cancer develops. And so in the lungs or in the bronchus area, the cancer develops as the fetus develops. And it stays in the body until it manifests as out-and-out cancer later in life. In even rarer cases, sometimes the lung goes into the intestine and it forms the cells that are the basis of intestinal cancer. So you can see that this is a cancer that was there before the person was born. And it goes deep into the past. And the 12th house is the house of ripe destiny. So this is somebody that is learning from a very, very long time back in history. If we look at the intestines and the lungs are both common signs. I've never studied embryology, and I would like to, but since both I wonder whether the 3 different layers of the embryo are related with the cardinal, fixed, and common signs, and that the lungs and intestines and the common signs come out of that same layer. But I've never had the opportunity to investigate it. It's another one of those things I'm frustrated by that I'll never get the never get the time to work out. So in this case, on the ascendant in midheaven are Gemini and Virgo, the signs that rule the intestines and the lungs. And it's conceivable that this person could eventually have intestinal cancer for the same reason. In this case of this patient, the cells developed in the bronchus leading to the upper lobe of the left lung. And it developed, and they kept growing until there was a very large tumor. A tumor the size of a pear. But it went completely undetected. And so they're curious. This horoscope is so textbook that it's almost as if the person came to birth to demonstrate its sins and how they work in physical things. Neptune rules clairvoyance. And this person had physical clairvoyance. He was actually able to see the tumor physically. He saw it when there was a needle biopsy. It was on live X-ray. He saw the needle go in and pull the tissue out, and he saw it through fiber optics. What they did with the patient is they wanted to see before they performed surgery. They wanted to see what was what, and they put a fiber optic tube with light down there, and they even let the patient look at his own tumor. And it was also seen a third way with another kind of physical world clairvoyance in ultrasound. You could see the thing growing there. All right. Speaking roughly, a tumor is a sac of salt water. Last night we talked about salt, sodium chloride being ruled by the moon, and the potassium family being ruled by the sun. And it's a amorphous protein that grows inside of a sac of salt water. That's what a tumor is. Now, normally the body is, in its chemistry, directed in the direction of potassium, especially in the cells. Intracellularly, the fluid is primarily the potassium family of ions or minerals, however you want to say it. And the interstitial fluids are sodium in nature. But sometimes the chemistry of the physical body turns sodium. And there are two occasions when that takes place. One is in a mother, when she's developing a fetus inside of her. The sodium orientation is to help facilitate the fast growth of a body. And the other occasion is cancer. When you have cancer, that lunar salt takes over the chemistry of the body, and it actually even expels potassium from the body. And this is partially what's involved with what is called a degenerative disease. Cancer is actually a degenerative disease because at the same time that the cancerous tumor is building, everything else is being vitiated in one way or another. Clearly, this points to the fact that the American diet is too sodium oriented. This is one of the, the way this all fits together is amazing. The Rosicrucian philosophy teaches that if you take in too much salt, you make yourself too subject to animalistic lunar desires. I find it in myself. Let me eat a bag of potato chips and I'm starting to have sexual thoughts. Not too late after that. And so the the sodium then it protects and it fosters growth, and it's a magnification of desire. And our society is way, way too big on eating salt. Now, the presence of amorphous protein is enhanced also by the American diet. The American diet is heavily into meat eating. And so we see that our culture is inclined. They don't cause the cancer. The cancer comes from the attitudes of abuse of the creative force, but those attitudes also foster the eating of flesh. And so we play into this. Now, this patient was a dietary experimenter, an explorer, tried one after another of diets, and at the time when the cancer grew rapidly, the most rapidly of all, it was starting to build up momentum, he was experimenting with a high-protein diet, an extremely high-protein diet with protein supplements and things like that. So it's all right, you can do things like that if you're a bodybuilder and building all kinds of muscles, but even then you can't do it for too long because it's not good for the body. Now, the time of the discovery of cancer in this person is a textbook example. If you look, the sun is in Scorpio, and by progression it gradually moved forward until it got into the 22nd degree, year by year. The sun usually progresses 1 degree a year. And when it got to 22 degrees of Sagittarius, it was square to that Neptune. And that is when the cancer was discovered. So this is textbook in its clarity. And the patient came down with a massive case of pneumonia. That's because the whole left lobe of the lung was blocked, and so the pneumonia got behind there, and it just, it had a field day. And what happened was that when the cancer was discovered, the pneumonia was so bad that they gave the patient 24-hour intravenous antibiotics, strong intravenous antibiotics. And this caused a terrible yeast infection, among other things. It broke up the balance between yeast and bacteria. And the antibiotics were so strong that they even attacked nerve cells in the ears. And the person had a case of tinnitus, which exists to this day. Now, the antibiotics were successful, and they helped the pneumonia, but the patient still had cancer. So, the normal medical treatment is surgical resection. But this patient has the sun in Scorpio opposite to Uranus in Taurus, and that's sort of an independent, pig-headed kind of person. And the patient resisted and opted instead for an alternative therapy. And after studying many, many alternative therapies, the patient decided that Gerson's therapy was the best. In fact, there is a book that is published by MIT, a very reputable publishing house called Choices or Alternatives in Healing. And they do a very statistical study of all of the alternative methods for dealing with cancer, and they come to the conclusion that Gerson's therapy is the best of them. So the patient started out with Gerson's therapy, and another problem arose, and that is that almost every successful case of eradicating cancer by an alternative therapy involves using animal substances, most notably pancreatin. And pancreatin is a digestive enzyme. And if you consume large amounts of it, it gets into the bloodstream. And it serves by breaking down the walls of the tumor. And this patient happened to be a pig-headed vegetarian and decided that he would not use animal substances even in the face of death. And so what happened is that everything else in the Gerson's therapy worked so well that the patient did not get rid of the tumor, but the body regenerated and was in excellent health, except from now and then there would be an upflaring of pneumonia. Now I have to talk about matters that require delicate sensitivity, and they require kindness and compassion. Now, the only reason for speaking of these things is because they get at the spiritual origin in the patient that resulted in this illness. So please focus on what's going to be said as these things on the patient and not on the collateral figures. That's an important thing. Now, at the time that this first crisis occurred, when the sun came square to Neptune, the patient was married. And the moon is in the 7th house, along with Saturn, and the patient was really not a good husband. The moon opposite Neptune shows that there was a lot of, how would you say it? I guess you'd have to say there was a lot of differences, and the marriage was on shaky psychological grounds. And the reason for that is this patient was not a good husband. He ignored his wife and was always off doing other things, ego things, things that were important to him and not necessarily things that were important to us. Now, the Gerson's therapy is something that requires a lot of support, and it requires 24-hour attention for months. It's as hard as chemotherapy, except that it's all natural and it's all healthy. And in all of this, the patient's wife was ignored even more and felt even more insecure and felt even more ignored and overly stressed. So in search of a better treatment of her and more of an appreciation of her, she took a secret lover. And just like the tumor became discovered, the secret lover became open, and that was the end of that marriage. The ending was very civil, but it was clear that they could no longer go together. Now we move forward. As the sun is moving forward, 4 years later, the sun comes square to the moon. And when that happened, out of the blue, the first love of the patient appeared in his life. Out of the blue. And they communicated. And the patient moved to halfway across the country to be with this person. And they decided they were going to be married. But the patient still had the tumor inside yet. It wasn't active, but it was still there. And the patient got one of those mild pneumonias, and with it developed a terrible cough. And with that cough, the weight of the tumor broke a blood vessel. and the patient began coughing blood. And there was, there wasn't enough time to take animal substances to prevent it, so the only option was to have the surgical resection. And so that was done. And it was done by a very skillful patient because there was something like a 2 millimeter resection margin between the tumor and the common aorta. So it was nip and tuck kind of a thing. What happened then in the recovery from the cancer, the love life of the patient took an unusual turn in that the woman decided or couldn't decide that she wanted to get married. And so the patient was left. He had no other financial or physical choice except to return to his home and take his old employment back. And he was basically left standing at the altar. Now, all of these things are extraneous to diagnosis, but they're pertinent to the spiritual diagnosis. There is an opinion among clairvoyants that inside of every tumor there is an entity that is created by the thoughts and emotions that are responsible for the illness itself. Neptune deals with spiritual entities, and in the 12th house, this is an exceedingly likely possibility. So these entities are formed, and they form as a result of a negative psychological complex. And what it was is that the patient, having the sun in Scorpio, had a certain amount of self-dislike. And the patient took about 5 years of contemplating why this all happened. And the conclusion that was reached was that the treacherous experiences that he could not blame on either his wife or the woman that couldn't make up her mind to marry him, that those treacherous experiences, he couldn't blame them on the women, and that he had made his own life. And it is likely, almost certain, that this is someone who was treacherous in his own past life. People probably trusted him, and he didn't follow their trust. Now, we're trying to be Christians. And in Christians, we practice forgiveness. And we forgive everyone. But this patient, over the course of this life or two, did not practice or did not allow self-forgiveness, and carried a lot of guilt. And there's no doubt that this tumor was a result of a guilt embodiment. And that guilt embodiment was a distraction. It was probably all about sex. No doubt at all, the person was probably treacherous in a past life over sexual matters. But the preoccupation with the complex that led to a guilt embodiment was sufficient so that the ego, that the self, could not maintain control over the growth function of the life ether. And so it just grew and grew and grew as a cancer. And so it's not, this is a perfect example of something that is a distraction, like Christ tells us to be whole and let your eye be central. And this person didn't do that. So we can see how Cancer then, as people are becoming stronger, their thoughts are becoming stronger, and deep down inside of them, they realize that they have abused the creative function. You see that every time there's an earthquake. People are tremendously afraid of earthquakes. And this is a throwback memory to Lemuria when the crust of the earth was forming and there were all of these earthquakes. And this is when we were first learning about the possibility of death. And so you can see these things are all tied together. Now this is a really simple and obvious case to diagnose. Some of the other ones are more difficult. But when you once have a few ideas and principles for diagnosis, you can apply them to others. Now, it shows that even though we did a lot of disagreeing and critiquing of Max Heindel, a lot of his statements were right on. And he was correct even to one detail. If you look at this horoscope, you have to look at it and study it for quite a while. The weakest planet in the horoscope is Saturn. And Saturn is the planet that normally leads inexorably to death. And because Saturn was weak in this horoscope, it didn't happen that way. So it was, like Max Heindel said, sometimes you can get over it, and it doesn't always lead to death. And that shows clearly in this example. All right, that's about as much as we have to offer today. So let's close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Time to turn the cooler on. Any questions?
How do you know this person?
Better every day.
Richard?
Yes.
Techniques of self-forgiveness.
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
We actually don't forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
And all forgiveness does not come from us. All forgiveness comes from grace. Meaning that love, that unconditioned and unconditional love from Christ and life spirit. Forgiveness is a matter of giving it an opportunity, of being open. But if you're so closed and dark about yourself, you can't see yourself in the way that Christ sees you. And the Christ ability is the ability to see others as yourself. In fact, the whole nature of life spirit in Christ is otherness. You don't really have a self. Christ is the self of all selves, but it is not self-oriented as we are. Everything it does is it serves the Father, or it serves everything that are its charges. And that's the only reason it can be unconditional love, because it doesn't have any self in it to get in the way.
How does it work with the archetype?
Cancer or?
Your whole relationship to it.
The archetype is an evacuated form of thought stuff. And what fills that evacuated form is the truth of life spirit, which is pure truth. And so if we form or reform our archetype of our life, we can do it in such a way as to be open to receive that in us. In order for us to advance spiritually, we have to become like Christ. And that means we still have a self yet, but that self is not self-motivated. It's motivated in serving of the others. In the same way that Christ receives from the Father, we receive from Christ, And in the same way that Christ gives to all of the creation, we give to whatever is before us that we can intuitively see needs. So when Christ says, like, I am the vine, and, in all of the cases in St. John's Gospel, it's very clear that we're to be like Christ, and the relationship of Christ is the relationship with the Father, and not being self-oriented at all. So did you have a good time at the lake?